Hi, I'm Dan Robinson with the Great Lakes Spirituality Project, and I am very honored to be talking with Reverend Deb Hansen today. Welcome, Reverend Hansen.
Thank you, Dan.
Glad to have you here. Um, Reverend Hansen is a board member for Michigan Interfaith Power and Light, which we'll talk about in a little bit. After a stint working in corporate America, she served as a hospital chaplain and now serves as a spiritual companion, working one on one with people, along with her work around water, energy, and climate issues in Michigan. So, lots going on there, lots to get at today. So, why don't we go ahead and get started? And like I said, you've had a very interesting and varied background in your work and personal spiritual journey. But I want to talk first about Michigan Interfaith Power and Light. For folks that maybe not are familiar with that organization, the group in Michigan, has over 300 member congregations across the state, representing more than 20 faith traditions and denominations, which is impressive. The group's mission is, on its website, says to inspire and equip people of faith to exercise stewardship of and love for all creation. And the group does that by offering practical ways to put faith into action, by promoting energy efficiency, renewable energy, and other sustainable practices that lead to a cleaner, healthier, and more just world. Wow, that's a pretty big mission.
It is, I agree.
Yeah. So can you say a little bit more about the work and how and the ways that you've been involved with Michigan Interfaith Power and Light?
Sure. Yeah, we have put a lot of focus on energy efficiency in houses of worship. So that ends up to be not only a savings for the congregation, but also a help in trying to mitigate what's happening with a destabilizing climate. And we're also very interested in reinstilling a respect and reverence for life, which all of this is based on.
So say a little bit more about that. How does Michigan IPL reinstill that reverence for life? What are some of the things that you try to do that?
Some of it is directly in support of various initiatives going on. I'll give you one example. We organized a multi-faith delegation from Michigan that went to the Treaty People Gathering in Minnesota in an effort to stop the Line 3 tar sands expansion project that is now unfortunately complete in northern Minnesota, even though there's still legal action going. We have typically, before COVID times, organized a biannual conference, which has had practical tips, but it also has begun with the last one we had was putting together an Indigenous elder, Frank Edegawishik, and the executive director of a small group in Highland Park called Solidarity, and Shamika Nichols represented. So that was a change in generations. Shamika happens to be African American. So we're trying to, again, get to know one another around the state. And we have supported an effort to stop the water shutoffs, for example, in Detroit during the mass water shutoffs. So it's a combination of what we're doing with getting actually out in the field with supporting various initiatives that are going on. Line 5 would be another example of that, where the Episcopal Bishop of Northern Michigan, Rayford Ray, put together a sign-on letter, and we had a contingent that went to Lansing to deliver that with very much the language that you'd expect to come from faith and spirituality, which is, we have protecting these waters for ourselves and for the future is a sacred trust. It is a sacred responsibility.
Well, yeah, that's a great connection for me because I wanted to ask you why you think it's important that the work in protecting the ecosystems in which we live, why that needs to have a spiritual or religious perspective to that work. Why do you think that's important?
Oh, Dan, that's such a great question. Uh, for me, it's so important to get to the heart, to get to a deep place. And for me, that requires the spiritual perspective. It's very easy to stay on the surface. For example, with climate, Michigan IPL is a state organization, but it's part of a national initiative, Interfaith Power and Light, that was founded as a religious response to climate change, global warming. And so for me, it's really essential. I also realize that religion, for a lot of people and for some good reasons, has gotten a bad rap out there. So part of it for me is reinstilling spiritual leadership in the state. And I think that's really essential. And for me, I guess I look at religion a little differently than some others may look at it. There are organizations, there are institutions, there are faith traditions. But I think there's something deeper. There is a religious response that rises up spontaneously in people when they are face to face with the beauty of a sunrise or a sunset, a child, a puppy, a beautiful shade tree. And it is that human experience that we share, this urge to share and celebrate life together in community.
Well, that's a great image. I love that idea of the human response to those sort of spiritual, probably a bad phrase, but spiritual prompts that we experience in the world around us. And as you're talking about this, it strikes me that there's a couple of different approaches to this. One is that idea of the spiritual reaching each of us individually, as you so eloquently put, speaking to that human in all of us. But then there's also the side of it where we are calling the religious communities themselves to action, because you mentioned the idea of spiritual leadership in the state. What have you? How have you? How do you think there's the reaction to the work of addressing, for example, climate change? How has the spiritual leadership's reaction to that been, do you feel like, in Michigan?
I am really proud of interfaith work in bringing people together across divides. I am also really proud. I was also on the campaign to decommission Line 5 for a number of years before moving more to solutions. And the relationships that we have built with Line 5, with the Indigenous communities, and also in Detroit with the African American community. I hope it's okay to say that racialized politics in this state is a thing. And it's something that I feel we have a responsibility to soften in the interest of one human family and one larger circle of life in the world. So I'm really proud of those relationships. We have formed, so treaty rights, I mentioned the journey that we took to Minnesota. I want to treat those as two separate things. It is so important that we have positive relationships, even healing relationships, the dominant culture with the Indigenous peoples of the state. And part of it's just in the interest of healing for all of us, with some of the history that's been more than difficult. But there are also practical implications in that the tribal peoples have legal openings because of these treaties that we in the dominant culture don't necessarily have. So there is good reasons beyond relationship for us working together. And the best for me of Indigenous traditions, and we all go back in some geography to Indigenous people, there's something right about the first people here of me learning to listen and respect the wisdom and the experience that translate into what I would call the 5 R's. It is relationship, not just with one another, but relationships with the living water that are here. Relationships looking at the other creatures is relatives, is kin. So it's yes within the human family, and it's so much more. So part of the dis-ease that I would say that we are suffering from right now is that we have started to look at water, oil, minerals, trees, forests is natural resources, stuff that is there to be in service to the human. And in reality, these are our relatives, or at least that's a healthier way of looking at it. And they're also, when you're talking about water and clean air and healthy soil in a climate that is stable enough to grow food, these are actual sources of life. And I love the definition of sacred is worthy of our deepest respect and care. That's a very practical definition of that. So I think there's a lot that we have to learn from Indigenous communities is they are reclaiming culture, language, tradition. These are people who've lived in harmony on this land for a very long time. So, that cultural humility, I think, is really essential. I also wanted to say with the relationships in the predominantly African-American community, Detroit is one specific example I could give is on the water shutoffs, but also when it comes to climate. I don't know if you've heard the story about Highland Park not being able to pay their electric bill to DTE. And DTE said, okay, fine, no problem. We won't just cut off your streetlights. We will literally take them away from you. Pretty incredible story.
Wow.
And that adversity actually birthed a very cool nonprofit. I mentioned Shamika Nichols earlier, called Solidarity, which is a play on words between soul, solar, and solidarity. So Michigan IPL has supported Solidarity with some of their initiatives, but they are installing solar streetlights. They're supporting an eco-village called Avalon Village to do a lot of things with renewable energy. And Solidarity is turning out into be a thought leader in what we would call energy democracy, which is really bringing the decision-making power for where our energy is coming from, either at the household level and at the community level, and 100% renewable energy cities. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but we have a number of Michigan cities that have committed to 100% renewable energy goals. And that is a wonderful example of energy democracy at work. The city of Ann Arbor is looking at forming their own utility there so that they can achieve the 100% goals that they have targeted there.
I love that image you used of this idea of relationships because it talks about connections with not just amongst people, but amongst the world around us, but also in terms of issues. Because when you start in one place, say energy, it leads to problems with racial injustice, which leads to problems with democracy not being respected. And so these connections are very pervasive, and it kind of reminds me of the conversation you and I had just before we got on to the formal part of this conversation, where we talked about the word environment and how you're not a big fan of it, and I think we both agreed on the point. But I want to ask you to say a little bit more about, why do you not like that word environment?
I hope I won't lose any friends over this. Yeah, to look inside at a built environment, that I'm comfortable with calling an environment. But when I'm looking outside at a lake, at a river, at a forest, my garden, that's life itself. That's life itself. And I am not separate from that. I am, and you are, part of that circle, not superior to it, not at the center of it, but really in a humble state of being utterly dependent with every breath on clean air. I can't go for too long without a glass of water. My body is not going to be healthy if the body of the Earth Mother is not healthy. So it's really all connected and puts us on a more healthy footing of reciprocity, that I'm not just a consumer taking, that I have a responsibility not only to myself and the human family, but also to future generations, to leave what I've enjoyed, hopefully in better shape than I received it.
That's great. Well, thank you for sharing that. So you mentioned future generations, and you talked a lot about a certain perspective or a certain set of values in that relationship with the world around us. Um, when we were exchanging emails prior to this conversation, you mentioned your dad, because I want to talk a little bit about your own journey here. And you mentioned your dad had a lot of influence on your values growing up, and he was, as you said, a hunter and a fisherman. Can you talk a little bit more about the influence he had on you as you look at some of these issues?
Yeah, thank you. This is taking me back to my childhood. You had mentioned Ludington, and my grandparents had a hunting cabin in Branch, which is about a half-hour inland from Ludington. So we would go up there, we would fish off the pier in Ludington, watch the car ferries, coal-fired car ferries steam in and out. I'm originally from Grand Rapids, so both there and in Grand Rapids, my dad, when I was a little girl, would take me out in the woods with him when he was hunting. And we would sit down at the base of a tree, and he would teach me about what I was seeing, how to identify the trees, the nuts, the other creatures and their habits. And it was less about naming things, but it was about the spirit of the thing, of just a real reverence and a love and a respect for the natural world, not taking more than you need. When I was a kid, we had somewhat of a subsistence life in that, my dad would bring home pheasants, a deer once a year, even squirrel and rabbit we would eat. And so, to know where your food is coming from, I happen to be vegetarian now and don't eat meat anymore, but hunting for me is a very respectful way if you're going to eat meat, to know how to know what it is to take a life and to do that respectfully, and then to use every part of that creature that you can. I don't want to leave my mom out. Sure, her gift to me was a real support for education and a real belief in education. So both of those, but I think those things are really instilled at an early age, and it's the notion that we protect what we love. And so the kiddos have to get out on the land and on the water and really develop a sense of place. Not that I just love water or the Great Lakes, but I love the Straits of Mackinac.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I love Little Traverse Bay in Petoskey, and to see a sunset over that. That particularity is really important. It's real. I mean, that's about as real as you can get on this plane, is a tree, a river, unlike a political border, for example. That's made up stuff. That does not exist in the same sense that a living being exists.
Yeah. Well, thank you. So you talked about your growing up, and with, again, with our email exchanges, you talked about having grown up in the Catholic tradition, but now your spiritual journey is more of a multi-faith and earth-based spirituality. You talked about bringing in roots from Judaism, Buddhism, Catholicism. Can you talk a little bit more about that, kind of where your journey has taken you now, sort of this multi-faith aspect of it?
Yes, it started out with, I led a pretty protected childhood, and I had the opportunity, thanks to my mother, to study in France for a semester when I was in college. And that really was life-changing for me. And I realized that I was fascinated with the different ways that people had of looking at the world. And so that started out with culture and language. And then it kind of gradually shifted into what I would call a wisdom tradition, is another way of talking about a religion. And it's like, why wouldn't I take wisdom wherever I could find it? I grew up in a community, a suburb of Grand Rapids, where I don't think there were any Jewish kids in the school. And so I was kind of an unlikely person to be walking this path. It was nothing that I consciously, decided or thought about. I just always found it interesting in the relationships that I have built over time. I have a huge amount of respect for my Catholic roots. I feel like I've deepened that because Catholicism, Christianity came out of Judaism. So it has bridged that divide, so to speak, for me. So it's a lot about the wisdom, for sure, the stories, the art, the commonalities, but also the unique gift that I feel each tradition brings from its particular geography and time. There are a lot of commonalities, but there are also some differences. But, really looking at the unique gift of each one and honoring that. I am happy to pray in any house of worship and am honored, and I'm amazed, and my life has been so enriched by the friendships that I have built across traditions. It's been a huge blessing, and I think we have to learn how to act together in the interest of protecting life right now. It's that, and it's a wonderful opportunity. It's not just a task, it's exciting, it's fun, and very rewarding.
Well, that kind of brings me full circle to where we started the conversation, because I wanted to ask you, you talked a lot about in your own experience, the advantages of and the blessings of having different wisdom traditions coming together and learning from those. In terms of Michigan Interfaith Power and Light, what's the advantage of having folks from different traditions, religious and spiritual traditions, coming together to work on these issues around energy and climate versus just having a Catholic organization or a Buddhist organization or whatever it might be? What's the benefit to gain from that?
Mm. There's strength in numbers, but also the things that I mentioned from a personal level, apply as well. That this respect that comes naturally when we get to know one another is just, it gives people, in my experience, a huge burst of energy. There is something just exciting and life-giving about seeing things that have been separate being brought together. And it's not like you're trying to water things down. It's about really lifting up each of these traditions. I'll give you an example. We had a board meeting once, and I'm trying to think of what event actually catalyzed this, but it was some violence against the Muslim community. One of our board members happens to be Muslim from a community in Warren that has been very involved in water issues as well. And to hear him talk, he would work at the desk in their administrative facility. And he said that if someone would come in with a gun, that he would be the first one in the line of fire. And to receive that from someone that we know and love makes something that you might hear, read in the newspaper as a headline, see on the network news. It makes it so much more real to have a human being that you know and care about involved with these things. So I think it really gives us the potential in Michigan to speak with a louder voice and to come together. And there was a time when to have these things be separate made some sense. You had to have your own identity, you had to figure out who you were as a group. And you don't have to sacrifice that. You can build these relationships and be part of something larger while maintaining your religious or spiritual identity at the same time.
Well, that's a great place to end our conversation, because when I write on the blog, I talk a lot about spirituality, in part being how we see ourselves in the wider picture of reality. And it's so wonderful to hear you talk about those relationships in that bigger picture, sort of encompassed within the work of Michigan Interfaith Power and Light. So thank you for those stories, and thank you for sharing your own journey. I really appreciate it, Reverend Hansen.
Thank you, Dan. Thanks
All
so
right.
much.
You take care.